The clay prism sits behind glass in the Ashmolean Museum, small enough to be overlooked, quiet enough to be passed by, ordinary enough in shape that a visitor could drift past it without understanding what waits on its surface. It is roughly the size of a loaf of bread. Its four sides are covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The museum keeps it at a controlled temperature. The light is muted, indirect, careful. People move by. They glance. They continue. And yet this object catalog number WB62, discovered in the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq, and donated to the museum in 1923 by Herbert Weld Blundell, contains a statement that does not behave like decoration and does not read like ornament. It sits there with the stillness of administration, with the dryness of a ledger, with the tone of a document that assumes the reader already knows what world they are living in. It is written in Sumerian, the earliest known written language used by a civilization that flourished in Mesopotamia while Egypt's pyramids were still being built. The text is a king list, a chronology, a sequence of rulers, cities, dynasties. On first encounter, it appears to be standard historical material, the kind of thing states preserve when they want continuity, order, legitimacy. Names, successions, reign lengths, centers of power moving from one city to another. And then midway through that structure, between columns of names and durations, there appears a phrase that seems almost too calm for what it means. Then the flood swept over. It arrives without ceremony, no drama, no theological flourish, no elaborate warning, no attempt to persuade. The phrase is inserted into the list as if it belongs there in exactly the same way a new dynasty belongs there, or a transfer of capital belongs there. Then the text continues. Different kings, different cities, different dynasties. But the structure remains the same. The formula returns. Kingship descends from heaven. It establishes itself in a city. Kings rule in succession. The seat of rule moves again. The list does not present itself as myth. That is part of what makes it unsettling. It presents itself as record. If you are listening from somewhere quiet tonight, perhaps from a dark room, perhaps from a city far from southern Iraq, perhaps while the day has already ended where you are, notice how strange that is. Notice how strange it is that a text so dry, so administrative, so unadorned, would place a flood between two stretches of orderly political chronology and then move on as though civilization did not begin again from nothing but resumed, as though restoration was immediate, as though social structure, kingship institutions, all of it returned at once, following something like a remembered pattern. That is the question that begins here, not merely whether there was a flood. Flood traditions exist across cultures. Floods occur in history. Water destroys, rivers overflow. Catastrophe is not difficult to believe. But what this text suggests is stranger than destruction. It suggests continuity after destruction. It suggests that civilization was not slowly rediscovered by survivors learning again from bare necessity. It suggests that kingship itself, the whole apparatus of organized life, simply resumed. That what existed before the flood and what existed after the flood were not unrelated worlds, but phases in a pattern. A break, yes, but a break inside repetition. A catastrophe, yes, but a catastrophe followed by restoration according to forms that were already known. And if that is what the Sumerians thought they were documenting, then the implications widen very quickly, because now the question is no longer only historical, it becomes civilizational. What did they think history was? Did they think human life moves in a straight line, from primitive to advanced, from beginning toward permanent accumulation? Or did they think it cycles, rises, falls, returns, reappears? Did they think civilization begins once or more than once? The prism does not answer in commentary. It does not theorize. It simply records. But what it records forces the question into the open. The opening section of the king list gives 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Their cities are named. Their reign lengths are given. The format is standard. The numbers are not. Alulim rules in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalgar rules for 36,000 years. Enmenluana rules for 43,200 years. Across 8 kings, the total stretches to 241,200 years of kingship before the flood. And immediately, scholarship becomes uneasy. The usual explanations appear quickly: symbolic numbers, mythic time, semi-divine rulers, alternative reckoning systems, perhaps months instead of years, perhaps dynasties compressed into single names, perhaps numerology rather than history. The assumptions move in the same direction. These figures cannot be literal because humans do not live that long. Therefore, the text must be doing something other than documenting actual chronology. That conclusion may be reasonable. But what is often passed over too quickly is the manner of the numbers themselves. They are not given vaguely. They are precise. They are mathematically structured. They are not very long. They are 28,800. They are 36,000. They are exact within the base 60 system the Sumerians used. The precision does not feel poetic. It feels calculated. That matters. Because calculation implies a different kind of intention than ornament. If the goal were merely grandeur, simpler figures would do. 1,000 ages, endless years, time beyond memory. But the list does not say that. It uses specific values related to the same mathematical habits the Sumerians used elsewhere, including in astronomy, where long cycles mattered and precision mattered. And once that possibility enters the room, the whole pre-flood section begins to feel less like decorative impossibility and more like something structured according to rules we may not fully understand. What if the numbers are not random exaggerations? What if they are calibrated? What if the text is preserving durations meaningful on scales larger than ordinary human memory? What if the Sumerians were not using these figures to make the past feel grand, but to document a past they believed belonged to another order of time? After the flood, the reign lengths shrink. They do not instantly become normal. They taper. Hundreds of years, then less, then eventually durations that begin to resemble historical plausibility. That taper is itself unusual. If this were simply myth breaking off into history, why the gradual descent? Why not one mode before another, after? Why the careful numerical fading from impossible to unusual to nearly familiar? The list offers no explanation. It simply records the descent, and in doing so, it leaves open a possibility that the numbers are not there to amuse or impress, but to show transition, a shift in the scale of time itself. a change in the condition under which kingship existed before and after the flood. The text does not explain. It preserves. That is how this begins, with a small prism under quiet museum light, with a phrase inserted into a king list, as if catastrophe were a chronological marker, not a mythic spectacle. With numbers too exact to dismiss comfortably, too large to accept easily, and too calmly recorded to ignore. And with a possibility that remains difficult to shake once it has been seen that the Sumerians were not inventing a fantasy about beginnings, but preserving a memory of repetition, a memory of cycles, a memory that human civilization had risen before the waters and then rose again after them, not as a new invention, but as a return. The 8 kings before the flood remain the first great obstacle, not because the text hides them, but because it states them too plainly. Alulim in Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000. Enmenlu-Ana, 43,200. The pattern continues with the same dry documentary tone the text uses everywhere else. No warning that this is sacred poetry. No sign that the reader should switch from chronology to metaphor. No visible border saying that here the text becomes myth and later becomes history again. The style does not change. Only the scale changes. That is why the usual explanations, although understandable, leave something unresolved. Conventional scholarship tends to move quickly past the figures because the figures are impossible on ordinary terms. That much is obvious. But in moving quickly, something important may also be lost. The numbers are not vague, they are exact, and exactness changes the texture of the problem. 28,800 is not an emotional number. It is a computed number, so is 36,000, so is 43,200. These values belong naturally within the sexagesimal system. The Sumerians used the same base 60 structure that shaped their mathematics more broadly. That matters because the Sumerians were not mathematically careless. Their astronomical observations, their calculations of cycles, their administrative accounting all show a culture capable of disciplined, numeric thinking. When such a culture records specific numbers, precision itself becomes part of the evidence. It does not prove literalism, but it does complicate dismissal. If the numbers were only there to suggest ancient greatness, why not use rough immensities? Why not choose broad, swollen figures designed to awe? Why embed them so carefully in a mathematical system that appears again in contexts where the Sumerians were measuring, not fantasizing? This question becomes even more interesting when one remembers how much Mesopotamian thought was oriented towards cycles, including celestial cycles. The Sumerians observed the sky closely. Later Mesopotamian astronomy would become extraordinarily sophisticated. Even in earlier periods, the habits of calculation recurrence and patterned return were already embedded in the culture's way of measuring order. If long celestial periods mattered, then numbers in the thousands and tens of thousands were not automatically absurd to them as numbers. They belonged to a scale of observation that exceeded the individual lifespan. That possibility does not solve the problem, but it shifts it. Perhaps the antediluvian rains are not meant as ordinary biographies of men living like modern humans for impossible spans. Perhaps they are tracking something else. Dynastic periods, yes, some scholars suggest that, but perhaps also something even broader. Durations calibrated to cycles, ages, structured segments of time expressed through kingship, because kingship is the framework through which time itself is organized in the text. The king list never says this openly. it simply gives the data. And perhaps that is precisely why the data continue to trouble the reader. Because they are too precise to behave like loose symbolism and too impossible to accept without qualification. The tapering after the flood intensifies this unease. Rain lengths do not go from impossible to ordinary in a single leap. They diminish gradually, first hundreds upon hundreds of years, then lower still. Eventually, they enter the range where historical plausibility begins to flicker. That gradual descent feels less like a sharp boundary between myth and history, and more like an attempt to register transition. Something changes at the flood, not just location, not just dynasty. The very scale of rule changes. And this same structural pattern has a well-known parallel in another tradition. Genesis presents 10 patriarchs before the flood with extremely long lifespans, then a post-flood decline toward normality. The resemblance is obvious and long noted. Scholarship usually explains this by influence biblical writers adapting Mesopotamian traditions within a later theological framework. That may be historically persuasive. But even if it is true, it does not answer the more original question. Where did the older pattern come from? Why did the Sumerians already think in this form? Why did they preserve a deep pre-flood duration, a catastrophic break, and then a gradual reduction afterward? The King List itself is not a theological treatise. It is political documentation. It legitimizes rule by continuity. It was copied by scribes consulted by those for whom royal succession mattered. That makes its antediluvian section especially difficult. If the pre-flood figures were obvious fiction, even to the culture preserving them, why ground political legitimacy in them? Why attach dynasties to transparently ridiculous chronology? Why not begin where credibility begins? Unless credibility for the people preserving it lay precisely in not omitting the older record, unless they believed these were inherited data, unless they thought they were preserving archives, not inventing them. This possibility becomes more interesting when we look at the date of the prism itself. The surviving prism was inscribed around 1800 BCE, but it clearly draws on earlier sources. The cities it names in the pre-flood section were ancient, even by then. The formulas belong to older scribal habits. The whole text feels compiled, gathered, transmitted. It has the tone of a later scribe, organizing much older material into a durable form. And the cities named before the flood were real places. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. Archaeology confirms them. Eridu especially matters. Mesopotamians themselves considered it the oldest city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Excavations reveal deep levels of occupation and early sacred structures. The city was not imaginary. It belonged to the far horizon of remembered antiquity, yes, but it belonged there as an actual place. That creates a peculiar tension. The list anchors its most impossible chronology in real ancient cities. It does not invent some cloud world beyond geography. It locates the pre-flood age in places that existed, places with sacred continuity, places later Mesopotamians could point to and say here. Here was the beginning. Here kingship first came down. Why do that if the entire section is only a mythic preface? Why not separate the symbolic age from the historical landscape? Instead, the text roots the strange chronology in real geography and presents it in the same documentary style used for later rulers, whose existence the culture certainly took seriously. Again and again, The possibility returns. Perhaps the scribes believed they were maintaining old records. Perhaps they did not think they were composing imaginative prehistory at all. Perhaps the antediluvian section was preserved because it was received, not made. Something older had been handed down. Something tied to ancient centers. Something measured in ways later readers might preserve, without fully sharing the scale it claimed. That would explain the tone. It would explain the absence of embarrassment. It would explain why the text never signals a shift into fantasy. The scribe is not saying, "Listen now to the sacred tale of the age before history." He is saying, in effect, Enkidu Alulim became king. He ruled 28,800 years. The style is everything. It is so flat that it becomes eerie. And because it is eerie, the question keeps returning. Not whether the figures can be accepted without difficulty, but whether the people who preserved them thought they were preserving something factual on its own terms, something inherited from a horizon older than ordinary memory, something perhaps linked to cycles they believed extended far beyond the human life they themselves knew. If so, then the flood in the king list is not the beginning of history. It is a marker within a larger chronology, a division inside an already existing pattern. And that possibility leads directly toward the phrase itself, the three-word notation that divides before from after, and does so with such economy that it seems to assume the event needed no explanation at all. The phrase is brief enough to be overlooked. That may be part of its power. 3 Sumerian words. Commonly translated then, the flood swept over. No preface, no flourish, no explanation. No attempt to tell the reader why the flood matters, or what sort of flood it was, or who caused it, or how the survivors endured it. The phrase is simply placed inside the king list as a chronological boundary. Before it, the pre-flood kings. After it, a new beginning of kingship. The flood functions not as a dramatic scene, but as a dividing line in a record. That restraint is important. The Sumerians had no difficulty elaborating myth when they wished to elaborate it. Other texts do exactly that, but the king list does not. Here the flood is treated as already known. The notation assumes the reader needs no clarification. The event belongs to shared understanding. The phrase serves the way a civilization uses a universally recognized rupture. Before the war, after the collapse, before the exile, after the fire. The event itself need not be narrated because its place in memory is already secure. And yet, the word used is not vague. It does not mean heavy rain or ordinary inundation. It refers to catastrophe, to overwhelming flood, to a deluge that sweeps over. The verb suggests total coverage, overpowering force, not seasonal flooding, of the kind Mesopotamians knew intimately. This is not irrigation trouble, not annual river swelling. It is something larger in the language, something age-dividing. The question then is how that notation relates to the fuller flood traditions preserved elsewhere. One fragmentary tablet from the Penn Museum, often called the Eridu Genesis, contains a damaged Sumerian flood account. The text is incomplete, painfully so, but what survives is revealing. Humanity is created. Cities are established. Kingship descends from heaven. Population grows. The gods deliberate. Enlil decides on flood. Enki warns a righteous figure, Ziusudra, who is both king and priest. Instructions are given. A boat is built. The flood comes. Ziusudra survives and receives a form of divine reward. Even in its damaged state, the the text's tone remains strikingly procedural: deliberation, decision, warning, compliance, survival. There is less theatricality than one might expect. Compared with later retellings, the atmosphere feels administrative, almost report-like, as though the theological frame exists, but the habit of record-keeping remains strong enough to keep the language from dissolving into spectacle. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic expands the flood story more fully and introduces a pattern that matters for everything that follows. The flood is not the first catastrophe. Before it come plague, drought, famine. Again and again humanity is reduced, and again humanity survives, usually because Enki intervenes. The gods are frustrated. Humanity is noisy, excessive, destabilizing. Enlil seeks a final solution. Enki subverts finality. The flood is thus not merely disaster. It is the climax of repeated crisis management. That pattern matters because it suggests the flood is not isolated. Catastrophe has precedent. Intervention has precedent. Survival has precedent. And if that is true, then the flood tradition may already be framed within a more cyclical understanding of human history than a single beginning and end narrative would allow. Archaeology complicates this in its own way. Excavations at sites like Ur-Kish Uruk and Shurapak revealed flood deposits, layers of water-laid sediment, separating periods of occupation. That is real. Woolley's famous clay layer at Ur was once heralded as evidence of the biblical flood, though later work showed it was localized and not universal. Other cities show flood deposits at different dates. Shurapak around 2900 BCE, Kish around 3200 BCE, Ur at another horizon. Real floods, yes. Not one single synchronized event across all Mesopotamia. So, what do the texts remember? One localized flood, several conflated over time. A cultural memory of repeated catastrophe condensed into one age-dividing deluge. Or something older, still something no longer easily visible archaeologically. That question opens wider when we remember that the Persian Gulf region itself was once dry land during the last glacial maximum. Later rising waters submerged vast areas. If ancient occupation existed there, it now lies buried under water and silt. Some have wondered whether the flood tradition preserves a remote memory of such inundation. That raises other problems of continuity, of course. How would memory survive so long? How would institutions carry it across millennia? The answer, if there is one, may lie in institutions themselves. Temples, archives, sacred sites continually rebuilt. If memory is not merely oral, but institutional, preserved through places, rituals, copied records, and repeated formulas, then astonishing durability becomes less impossible. The Sumerians did not say they invented writing from nothing. They treated major arts of civilization as gifts already complete when given. That language may be mythological. It may also preserve an awareness that foundational systems were inherited rather than newly developed inside the horizon of living memory. And if writing mathematics kingship and sacred order were all understood as inherited, then the flood notation in the king list begins to look less like an imaginative insertion and more like archival maintenance. A scribe copying what prior records already stated. A break preserved because it belonged to the record, not because it needed embellishment. The sparseness would then make sense. Archives often preserve more than they explain. A chronicle says only what must be entered. The rest is assumed knowledge or stored elsewhere. In that light, then, the flood swept over does not feel incomplete. It feels exact. It feels like the line a conscientious scribe writes when the event is too large and too well known to require commentary inside a king list. That possibility becomes more significant when we turn to what follows the line. Because the flood in these texts does not usher in a long darkness of forgetting. It does not leave humanity to slowly rediscover organization over generations. Instead, the formula restarts almost immediately. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The phrase is almost identical to the beginning of the pre-flood section. That parallel matters more than almost anything else, because it means the flood did not interrupt the concept of kingship itself. Kingship descends again. The institution resumes. Civilization continues not as invention, but as restoration. The same pattern, the same language, the same administrative form. A new city, yes, but the same structure. And once that is noticed, the flood becomes even stranger. Not only because it destroys, but because it fails to erase the template. The pattern survives the waters. The knowledge survives the waters. Something survives that allows the world after catastrophe to resume in recognizably the same civilizational shape. That is not the language of beginning from nothing. It is the language of reactivation. And whatever one finally believes about the flood, about the chronology, about the status of these texts, that much is difficult to avoid. The Sumerians preserved the flood as a break between ages, yes, but they also preserved it as a break after which the order of kingship returns immediately, as though the deeper thing beneath cities and dynasties had never actually been destroyed. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. The repetition is deliberate. It is also one of the most revealing details in the entire text. The phrase used after the flood is not the language of slow reconstruction. It is not the language of primitive recovery. It is not the language of survivors inventing law institutions, hierarchy, writing bureaucracy, and temple organization for the first time. It is the language of restoration. The same cosmic office returns. The same institutional principle descends once more. The location changes. The form does not. That matters because the king list gives us not a story of origins, but a story of resumed order. The kingship was in Eridu before the flood. After the flood, it was in Kish. Then it moved as before from city to city. The wording implies something astonishingly stable beneath catastrophe. Cities may be broken, ages may be divided, but kingship itself, understood as a complete divine institution, survives the rupture and is reestablished with the same authority it possessed before. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship was not a human invention. It was not a social contract arising gradually from practical need. It was something that came from above. When the texts say it descended from heaven, they do not merely mean that later rulers liked divine rhetoric. They mean that kingship was conceived as a fully formed institution with protocols, powers, offices, responsibilities, and symbolic weight independent of any one man. The king occupied a pre-existing office. He did not invent it. That becomes crucial after the flood. Because if kingship comes back immediately, then so too must the knowledge required to enact it. A kingdom cannot function with only a king. It needs administration, priesthood, record-keeping, resource distribution, legal procedure, labor organization, temple structure, all the apparatus that turns a title into a civilization. And the king list gives no indication that these things had to be slowly rediscovered. It simply resumes the record. This is where the conventional historical reading becomes strained. From a modern perspective, complex civilization takes time. Writing systems do not spring fully formed from catastrophe survivors. Bureaucracies are not improvised in a generation. Monumental architecture requires expertise, labor coordination, logistics precedent. States do not simply reappear without templates. And yet the Mesopotamian tradition presents exactly that, not invention, but restoration from pattern. One can, of course, interpret descended from heaven as pure ideology, royal rhetoric, a theological gloss over ordinary historical development. But that interpretation raises its own difficulty. The King List was not a casual poem. It functioned inside political culture as a chronicle copied over centuries, consulted for legitimacy, used in claims of succession and continuity. If the whole framework were understood as ornamental fiction, would it have held the same administrative weight, perhaps? But perhaps not. There is another possibility. The scribes may have believed what they were preserving. They may have believed that civilization before the flood had been fully developed, that it possessed institutions and patterns which somehow were carried through catastrophe and reinstated afterward. Not learned from the beginning, but restored from preserved knowledge. This would explain something archaeology sometimes makes difficult to ignore: the apparent early sophistication of Mesopotamian urban centers. Kish appears already urbanized early in its visible history. Uruk emerges at scale. Monumental architecture, administrative complexity, and specialized labor do not look like the first hesitant experiments of a species discovering organization from zero. They look like structured civilizational expression. The White Temple at Uruk, elevated on its great platform, did not arise from improvisation. Its construction required mass labor, long planning, logistical continuity, and an already functioning social structure capable of mobilizing and sustaining such effort. In such cases, archaeology can say gradual development occurred elsewhere or earlier, and often that is reasonable. But the King List offers a different conceptual model. Civilization appears where kingship descends, because kingship brings the entire institutional pattern with it. In that model, the city does not slowly become civilized. It receives civilization. This is where the Sumerian concept of the me begins to matter. The me, where the fundamental principles, decrees, powers, or patterns governing all civilized life. Kingship was one of them, but only one among many. Others included priesthood law, craft music writing judgment, sexual order, social roles, war peace, and all the other forms by which society became ordered rather than chaotic. The Emi were not invented by cities. Cities instantiated them. Whoever possessed or embodied the me possessed civilization in working form. So when kingship descends again after the flood, one can read that not as a single crown falling from the sky, but as the restoration of a complete pattern set. The office returns along with the civilizational principles that make the office operable. The flood breaks continuity of place, perhaps, but not continuity of form. That possibility becomes stronger if we imagine preserved archives, priestly continuity, or survivors who maintain technical and ritual knowledge. The traditions themselves repeatedly emphasize that survival is not only physical. The flood hero receives instructions. The boat is built according to exact dimensions. Animals and provisions are preserved. Sacrifice after the flood is performed correctly. These are not the gestures of a man beginning from ignorance. They are the actions of someone carrying knowledge through catastrophe. Knowledge survival may be the entire key. Without preserved knowledge, catastrophe leaves only fragments. With preserved knowledge, catastrophe becomes interruption rather than erasure. The king list seems to assume interruption. This is why the post-flood section is so significant. It does not narrate a long darkness. It does not begin with scattered tribes. It begins with kingship in Kish, then with a dynasty, then with further dynasties. The chronicle grows more detailed, not less. That continuity of record suggests that in the Sumerian view, institutional life after catastrophe resumed inside an already known frame. One can push back, of course. Perhaps the list was compiled much later and simply projected full institutions backward. That is possible. Yet even that projection tells us something. It tells us what the compilers believed civilization was not, an invention made by trial and error after disaster, but a pattern restored according to precedent. That belief matters whether or not every detail in the chronology is historically exact, because it reveals a worldview, and that worldview is profoundly nonlinear. Humanity does not progress from simple to complex once and for all. Rather, ordered life can be broken and then resumed. The templates outlast the destruction. The me remain, the patterns remain. Kingship descends again. That phrase repeated before and after the flood may be the deepest clue the text provides. It suggests that civilization is portable at the level of form. The city changes, the office does not. The age changes, the pattern does not. The catastrophe breaks one manifestation. Another emerges under the same governing design. And if that is so, then the flood is not only a past event, it becomes precedent. A demonstration that civilizational order can pass through ruin and reappear. Which raises a darker possibility the text itself does not avoid. If restoration happened once, it could happen again. If civilization can be resumed from preserved patterns, then history is not simply a line moving forward. It is a sequence of rises, collapses, and reactivations. What matters most is not permanent material continuity, but whether the knowledge of the pattern survives the next rupture. That may be why the Mesopotamians preserved so much with such intensity. Not because archives were merely administrative conveniences, but because archives, rituals, and scribal traditions were the means by which civilization itself could be brought back when the waters, or whatever follows the waters, came again. This is where the pattern of catastrophe begins to widen beyond the flood itself. Because in the Atrahasis epic, the flood is not the first intervention. That detail matters more than it first appears to. Humanity is created to relieve the gods of labor. The younger gods had done the heavy work of maintaining order, digging canals, supporting the world's infrastructure, enduring the burden of civilization's foundations, and they rebelled. Humanity enters the picture as a solution, a delegated labor force. Already the story is administrative before it becomes catastrophic. There is a problem in the system, a workforce crisis, a redistribution of burden. Then humanity multiplies. Then humanity becomes noisy. Not only noisy in the trivial sense, though the text says that too, but noisy in the deeper Mesopotamian sense of disorder, pressure, excess, imbalance. Enlil cannot sleep. The peace of the ordered cosmos is disturbed. The gods act. First plague. Humanity survives. Then drought. Humanity survives. Then famine. Humanity survives. Only after these repeated failures of reduction does Enlil turn to flood. This sequence is easy to miss if one reads only for the final catastrophe. But the sequence changes everything. It means the flood is not an isolated, divine outburst. It is the terminal point in a chain of repeated corrective attempts. Catastrophe, then, is already cyclical inside the text. Intervention recurs. Humanity persists. Pressure builds again. Intervention returns. That is not linear history. That is pattern. Enki's repeated role is equally important. Each time a reduction is sent, he finds a way for humans to endure. He advises. He protects. He preserves through knowledge. Worship this God. Seek this water. Build in this way. Act according to instruction. Survival comes not from brute luck, but from preserved understanding. The one who knows the pattern can endure the phase of destruction. Then comes the flood, meant to be total. The gods even bind themselves by oath not to warn humanity. Final means final. Yet Enki still finds the loophole. He speaks to the wall. The man hears. The boat is built. The dimensions are precise. The ceiling is precise. The provisions are precise. This is not vague salvation. It is technical survival. And what follows is just as revealing as the flood itself. The gods do not achieve finality. Humanity survives again. The flood was meant to terminate the problem. Instead, it produces another compromise. Human lifespan will be shortened. Fertility will be limited. Mortality will become a stronger regulating force. But humanity continues. The order continues. The tension remains unresolved, only managed differently. That is a cycle, not a conclusion. One can almost feel the text thinking in terms of recurrence. Problems return because life returns. Excess returns because continuity returns. Catastrophe does not end, the process only redirects it. The flood is not a final end. It is one phase in a larger oscillation between flourishing excess breakdown preservation and resumed order. This is why the flood hero matters so much. Atrahasis Ziusudra Utnapishtim. Different names, same structural function. The survivor is not merely the fortunate man who lives when others die. He is the bearer of continuity. He carries technical knowledge across rupture. He is the bridge between ages. He makes restoration possible. That bridge is the real center of the story. Because without preserved knowledge, the catastrophe would truly reset history. But the texts do not imagine reset. They imagine transfer. The boat itself becomes an archive. Not an archive of tablets, at least not explicitly, though one can imagine that possibility, but certainly an archive of life skills, animals, continuity, offerings, procedure. The survivor does not step into a blank world with nothing but memory of fear. He steps into a damaged world, carrying enough of the old pattern to begin the new phase. That is why the king list can resume so quickly, because within this worldview, the patterns are never completely lost. The flood traditions also preserve something else, the sense that catastrophe is not shocking in principle, only in scale. The gods do not debate whether intervention should ever occur. They debate which intervention and how total it must be. The system expects crisis. The question is how crisis will be managed, and whether the preserving wisdom of Enki will remain available within it. This expectation of recurrence aligns beautifully, or perhaps disturbingly, with the larger Mesopotamian obsession with cycles. Astronomical cycles, agricultural cycles, lunar cycles, ritual cycles, dynastic cycles, divine descent and return. The Atrahasis structure belongs in that same mental world. It is not an anomaly. It is another expression of the conviction that reality moves through phases, not only through a straight line. And if that is true, then the flood narrative begins to feel less like a singular mythic event and more like the archetype of civilizational crisis itself. Not one disaster among others, but the model by which later crises are understood. Too much growth, too much noise. Balance fails. Catastrophe comes. Knowledge preserves a remnant. Restoration begins. Then the pattern gradually builds towards strain again. One wonders then whether the Sumerians thought the flood had happened once, or whether they thought it represented the kind of thing that happens when cycles reach a breaking point. The texts never fully say. But they do not treat catastrophe as alien to the structure of reality. Quite the opposite. Catastrophe is built into the relationship between divine order and human proliferation. The possibility of dissolution is always present. That possibility may explain the extraordinary seriousness with which Mesopotamian institutions approached preservation. If the world can break, then archives matter. Ritual matters. Exact wording matters. Mathematical continuity matters. It becomes possible to imagine scribes, priests, and scholars not merely as record keepers of the present, but as custodians for after the next rupture. This may sound too grand, too modern, too suspiciously apocalyptic, but the texts themselves keep leaning in that direction. Again and again, survival depends on those who know. Again and again, continuity depends on technical details being maintained. Again and again, catastrophe does not erase everything, because not everything is left to perish with the cities. The flood then becomes both a memory and a template. A memory of what happened, a template for what happens. This is why the post-flood world in these traditions is not born innocent. It is born instructed. It knows something. It carries something. It does not stand at the first dawn of civilization. It stands after a rupture with patterns already in hand. And if the patterns were already in hand after one catastrophe, then the idea that civilization itself might be cyclical begins to feel less speculative. The structure is already there in the texts. The flood is not absolute beginning or absolute end. It is one great turn in a wheel whose motion the Sumerians may have believed they were preserving in writing. If catastrophe repeats, then knowledge becomes the central question. Not only whether knowledge exists, but where it resides, how it moves, how it survives, and whether it can be restored after rupture. This is where the Mesopotamian concept of the ME becomes indispensable. The word resists easy translation. Divine decrees, powers, ordinances, foundational attributes. None of these are wrong, and none are enough. The me are something like the operating principles of civilization, the patterns that make ordered life possible at every level. They include kingship, priesthood, craft, music, judgment, law, sexuality, authority, truth, through the battle, peace, ritual, office, practical skill, social role, even emotional and cultural states. Together, they form not a single idea, but a complete matrix of civilization. This is what matters. The me are not invented by humans. They pre-exist human institutions. Civilization does not create them. Civilization receives them, instantiates them, carries them, loses them, regains them. That is already a cyclical model. The myth of Inanna and Enki expresses this with unusual clarity. Inanna visits Eridu, the oldest city seat of Enki, keeper of wisdom, and the me. There is a feast. There is beer. Enki, in his generosity or intoxication, or perhaps in some deeper inevitability disguised as accident, gives Inanna the me. She loads them onto a boat. She carries them away to Uruk. When Enki realizes what has happened, he sends attempts to retrieve them. Those attempts fail. Inanna arrives in Uruk and establishes the me there. Read politically, the story explains Uruk's rise over Eridu. Read structurally, it says something even more profound. Civilization is transferable. Its patterns are portable. The me move. The principles that make a city into a center of order can be carried not physically like bricks, but formally like an encoded system. And they do not disappear when transferred. This matters too. The ME are not exhausted by movement. They can be active in more than one place. What matters is access, possession, enactment, custody. Civilization, in other words, is not identical with its material embodiment. It depends on pattern information that can survive the destruction or abandonment of a particular city. That distinction changes everything. Because if the material city falls, but the me remain accessible, then restoration is possible. If the temple burns, but the ritual patterns survive, the temple can be rebuilt. If dynasties end, but kingship, as me remains kingship, can descend again. If a civilization collapses, but the operative principles are preserved in text ritual, memory training, then civilization has not been annihilated at the level that matters most. It has been interrupted. This is why the flood traditions and the me traditions belong together. The flood destroys manifestation. The me preserve form. The survivor crosses catastrophe not only with animals and provisions, but with enough of the old pattern to restore ordered life. The king list's immediate post-flood resumption of kingship only makes sense in a world where civilization is stored in something deeper than buildings. Mesopotamian temple archives begin to look very different when seen in that light. They are not only houses of worship or administrative storage, they become repositories of patterns, mathematical tables, lexical lists, legal precedents, liturgies, myths, technical instructions, all copied and recopied with obsessive care. One can dismiss this as traditionalism. One can also see it as insurance. Insurance against forgetting. Insurance against collapse. Insurance against the next phase of the cycle. The precision of preservation begins to make sense if the me, or whatever practical equivalent of them one chooses to emphasize, are understood as eternal forms temporarily embodied in cities and institutions. A scribe copying an old tablet is not merely transmitting literature. He is keeping a civilizational principle legible for future restoration. A priest performing a ritual is not merely commemorating tradition. He is maintaining alignment with an order that outlasts any one historical moment. The same is true of language itself. Sumerian remained a scribal and sacred language long after Akkadian became the common spoken medium. That persistence may look conservative or artificial, but from the inside, it carries another meaning. If the old knowledge is embedded in an old language, then preserving the language becomes part of preserving the pattern. Translation may distort. Simplification may forget. Better to maintain the ancient forms exactly than risk losing access to what they preserve. Mathematics shows the same logic. The sexagesimal system, awkward for some everyday purposes, remained powerful for astronomical and computational ones. Once more, preservation seems to exceed convenience. The system is kept because it is bound up with the patterns themselves. It works at scales that matter beyond immediate utility. All of this produces a striking picture of civilization, not as a one-time invention that gradually accumulates from ignorance toward permanence, but as a set of eternal or near-eternal patterns that can be manifested, lost, preserved, transferred, and manifested again. That is why the me never truly die. Only cities do. Only empires do. Only particular arrangements do. The patterns wait. This may also explain Mesopotamian attitudes toward innovation. They certainly developed, refined, and improved many things. But innovation is often framed less as creating the unprecedented, and more as uncovering, receiving, restoring, or more fully instantiating what already exists in principle. The eternal pattern is deeper than its current expression. To discover something new is often to rediscover or reveal what was latent. That attitude is perfectly consistent with cyclical civilization. If history repeats in structure, then what matters most is not novelty for its own sake, but fidelity to the underlying forms that allow order to return after each dissolution. The flood hero preserves life. The temple preserves the patterns of life. The scribe preserves the language of those patterns. The priest preserves their enactment. The king preserves their political embodiment. And all of that together means that catastrophe, though terrible, need not erase everything. The me survive what the walls do not. Perhaps that is the calm confidence hidden beneath so much Mesopotamian literature. Not optimism, exactly. They were too realistic for optimism of that kind. But confidence that restoration is possible, because the foundations of restoration are never wholly destroyed. If one city falls, another may receive the patterns. If one dynasty ends, kingship remains. If one age closes, another may begin under the same heavenly office. This is not abstract philosophy floating above history. It is woven into myths, chronicles, temple economies, scribal education, and political theology. It is everywhere, and once again the same conclusion approaches from another direction. The flood in the king list is not the erasure of civilization. It is the passage through which civilization, because its deepest patterns survive, can descend again. If the me are the patterns, then the stars may be the clock. That is not stated explicitly in any single line, the way a modern theory would state itself. But the cumulative evidence from Mesopotamian astronomy makes the possibility difficult to ignore. The people who preserved these flood traditions and king lists were also people who watched the heavens with extraordinary patience. They tracked planets, lunar cycles, eclipses, risings and settings of stars, seasonal intervals, and long-term celestial regularities with a seriousness that far exceeded casual curiosity. The Mulapin tradition, compiled in first millennium copies from older materials, shows this clearly. Lists of stars, dates of heliacal risings, lengths of daylight, intercalation rules, planetary intervals, technical tables. This is not the sky as decoration. This is the sky as system. And once the sky is understood as system, the possibility emerges that terrestrial life may also be system. The Mesopotamians tracked the visible planets with great care, Venus especially. Its cycle was known in striking detail. Lunar eclipses were not random terrors, but patterned events connected through recurring periods such as the Saros. The heavens returned to themselves, not immediately, not simply, but measurably. Recurrence is built into the sky. That matters because Mesopotamian thought did not sharply separate heaven and earth into unrelated domains. Celestial events and terrestrial events belong to a single, integrated order. Omens operated on that assumption. Astronomical diaries operated on that assumption. Ritual calendars operated on that assumption. If heaven moves in cycles, then the life of cities may do the same. This is where the long numbers in the king list begin to look stranger still. Some scholars have argued that the Sumerians did not explicitly know the precession of the equinoxes. Others suspect they may have preserved related numbers without naming the mechanism in modern terms. What matters here is not proving a specific astronomical theorem. What matters is recognizing that Mesopotamian culture was capable of thinking in long cycles and capable of preserving numerical structures meaningful far beyond one generation. A civilization that tracks great celestial rhythms is already living in a different relation to time. Not only annual time, not only dynastic time, potentially age-scale time. And if age-scale time matters, then the antediluvian reigns may no longer look like random impossibilities. They may look like durations attached to a different kind of reckoning, one in which kingship stands in for larger periods, or one in which political chronology is encoded in a framework already shaped by cosmic cycles. This possibility becomes sharper in the Omen series Enuma, Anu, Enlil, where celestial observation is linked to events on Earth. Eclipses, planets, stellar positions, atmospheric signs, all are treated as significant for kingship weather, war, and social order. From a modern standpoint, this is divination. From the Mesopotamian standpoint, it is pattern recognition within an integrated cosmos. They were not simply projecting meaning upward. They were reading correlation within a total system. If so, then their obsession with astronomical continuity may have had a practical end beyond calendar keeping. Watch the cycles, preserve the data, compare generations, look for recurrence. If great disturbances correlate with certain phases, then astronomy becomes not only ritual knowledge, but survival knowledge. The flood traditions themselves sometimes hint at celestial timing. The Gilgamesh flood account contains specific temporal cues, divine signs, storm riders, fixed times. Nothing there proves a modern astronomical theory, but it does suggest that catastrophe was not thought to be wholly disconnected from the larger patterned world of omens and cosmic timing. Then there is the institutional side of the matter. Astronomical records were copied over long periods. Observations outlived the observers. No one person would witness the completion of the longest cycles. This means the work only makes sense inside a culture committed to inheritance across generations. Data are kept because the future needs them. Precision is maintained because later readers may recognize patterns invisible now. This is the logic of archive extended to the sky. And once that logic exists, one can begin to imagine how a cyclical view of civilization would be sustained If stars return to positions, if eclipses recur, if Venus disappears and returns, if equinox points slowly shift across vast spans, then it is not difficult to see how a culture might come to believe that earthly order also rises and falls according to larger rhythms. The heavens do not move randomly. Why should kingship? This is not to say that Mesopotamian scribes sat with a modern theory of repeated global civilizations. That would be too crude. But it may well be that they understood time in layered cycles and saw human institutions as participating in those cycles, not escaping them. The annual ritual calendar already compresses this structure. Each year repeats creation, restoration, fertility, decline, return. Agricultural seasons make it visible. The moon makes it visible. Venus makes it visible. Political succession makes it visible. Flood and restoration make it visible at the great civilizational scale. The same form everywhere. Presence and absence. Ascent and descent. Order and dissolution. Return. That may be why their preservation systems were so elaborate. Oral tradition alone is fragile over very long spans. But oral tradition embedded in ritual, backed by writing, reinforced through temple practice, and synchronized with celestial observation, becomes extraordinarily durable. Knowledge can survive, not because one perfect archive is never destroyed, but because the pattern is stored redundantly in text, in performance, in architecture, in sacred site, in calendar, in schooling. This is a profoundly resilient civilizational design if one expects catastrophe. And perhaps expectation is the right word. The Mesopotamians did not behave like a people who thought stability was permanent. They behaved like a people who expected disruption and therefore devoted enormous effort to continuity mechanisms. Their texts, rituals, and astronomical traditions all suggest that the question was not whether patterns would recur, but whether anyone would still know how to read them when they did. The antediluvian figures then may belong to that same horizon of thought. Not merely mythic inflation, but encoded duration. Not necessarily transparent to us now, but structured enough to suggest relation to larger periodicity. The flood becomes a hinge between ages. Kingship descends again, not because history restarts from scratch, but because the pattern turns and the template is activated once more. This does not prove that human civilization literally repeats in the strongest possible sense, but it does show that the Sumerians preserved a worldview in which repetition at multiple scales was fundamental. The sky repeated, the year repeated, fertility repeated, kingship repeated, catastrophe repeated, restoration repeated. And if all of that is so, then the ancient records do not merely ask whether the flood happened. They ask whether we ourselves understand history far too narrowly when we imagine it as a line instead of a rhythm. The rhythm is not only in the stars, it is also in the gods. Inanna descends and returns. Dumuzi dies and returns. Cities fall and rise. Kingship moves and returns. The same pattern appears again and again, not always with the same scale, not always with the same emotional texture, but with a constancy that becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Presence, absence, return. Order, disruption, restoration. Life descent, emergence. Take Dumuzi. Modern readers often reduce him too quickly to vegetation myth. The dying and rising shepherd, the barren summer, the restored fertility of autumn. There is truth in that, but the pattern is deeper than simple crop allegory. Dumuzi is not merely grain. He is shepherd, royal figure associated with order, generative life continuity. His descent into the underworld is not an indistinct fading. It is structured, it is juridical, it is scheduled. 6 months below 6 months above, alternating with his sister Gestinana. That precision matters. The myth is not saying only that life dies. It is saying life is absent and returns according to patterned division. The world does not move randomly between presence and absence. It moves according to order. That same idea appears in Inanna's descent with even more intensity. She goes below. She is stripped at each gate. She is judged. She is fixed, killed, suspended. Then through substitution and negotiated return, she rises again. The underworld is not chaos. It is structured absence. The return is not miracle without condition. It is reinstatement through law, exchange, procedure. Again, the pattern is formal. That matters because if the Mesopotamians were merely telling stories about death, they had simpler ways to do it. But again and again, they narrate return as a regulated phase within a larger cycle, not endless life, not final death, recurring alternation. This same alternation is reflected at the level of the year, of course. Summer and drought, autumn and renewal. But once more, the myths do more than mirror farming conditions. They train perception. They teach that reality itself operates through recurring withdrawal and reappearance. That loss is not always terminal. That descent is not necessarily final. That absence may be part of structure rather than accident. And if that is true for God's seasons and underworld passages, why would it not be true for cities and civilizations? The city laments answer in their own way. These texts mourn destroyed urban centers, Nippur, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Sumer itself, not as if destruction were inconceivable, but as if it belonged to a known pattern requiring proper response. The city is glorious, then it is judged or abandoned, then storm, invasion, fire, collapse. The gods depart, the walls are breached, ritual ceases, mourning follows, petition follows, restoration is hoped for and often envisioned explicitly. These laments are not only emotional literature, they are procedural memory. They describe what a city is when ordered correctly. They describe what happens when that order collapses. They encode the forms that must be restored. In that sense, they are almost manuals of reassembly disguised as grief. They preserve temple arrangements, divine associations, sacred hierarchy, political identity. A city destroyed materially can still survive textually as a pattern awaiting reactivation. This is perfectly consistent with the logic of the ME. The city is not identical with its current bricks. The city is its instantiated form. Destroy the form and mourning is necessary. But if the pattern survives, restoration remains possible. Archaeology confirms the recurrence. Nippur is built, damaged, rebuilt, damaged, again, rebuilt again. Ur declines and rises. Babylon falls and rises. Across centuries, across regimes, the same sacred sites are returned to the same temples, rebuilt on ancient foundations. The same identities claimed again. Mesopotamian civilization does not behave like a people casually relocating after each catastrophe. It behaves like a people returning to charged nodes in a patterned world. That return is itself a kind of resurrection. Not metaphorically only, structurally. The city comes back because the pattern was never wholly lost. So, when Dumuzi returns, and when Inanna returns, and when kingship descends again, and when a ruined city is restored upon old foundations, these are not disconnected motifs. They are all expressions of one civilizational intuition. Existence is not secured by permanence of matter, but by persistence of form across phases of disappearance. That intuition reshapes the flood as well. The flood is no longer a singular aberration, but the largest expression of a universal rhythm already visible everywhere else. The world withdraws. The world returns. The king list records the great political version. Myth records the divine version. Ritual records the annual version. Agriculture records the seasonal version. Astronomy records the celestial version. Each scale mirrors the others. This is why the Mesopotamian view can feel at once pessimistic and strangely hopeful. Pessimistic because nothing manifested is guaranteed to last. Cities fall, gods descend, kingship moves, order dissolves, catastrophe comes. Hopeful because dissolution is not the end of the pattern. Return is built in. If the forms are maintained, if the knowledge survives, if the rituals continue, then what is absent can be made present again. That may be the deepest meaning of ritual itself in this culture. Ritual is not remembrance of one-time sacred events. It is participation in recurring sacred process. One does not merely remember Dumuzi's return. One helps enact the pattern by which return remains possible and intelligible. One does not merely commemorate cosmic order. One renews it. This is why neglect is so dangerous in Mesopotamian thought. Forgetting the pattern is more dangerous than losing the building. A ruined temple can be rebuilt if the form is known. But if the form is forgotten, restoration becomes impossible. The same may be true of civilization itself. And this brings us back inevitably to the possibility that what the Sumerians were preserving in king lists and myths and rituals was not just story, but operating memory. A memory that human life does not simply advance, but passes through recurring phases of height and collapse, and that the task of culture is to preserve the forms that allow reemergence. Dumuzi does not stay below forever. Inanna does not stay below forever. Cities do not stay below forever. Kingship does not stay below forever. The flood does not end the pattern. It forces the pattern to turn. The city laments deserve to be lingered over because they show with unusual clarity what a cyclical civilization sounds like when it is grieving. The lament for Nippur, like the laments for Ur-Sumer Uruk and Eridu, does not merely weep over destruction as a random cruelty. It follows a pattern: glory, order, proper worship, prosperity, then abandonment, storm, breach, ruin, divine withdrawal, desolation, then petition, then the hope, often the expectation of restoration. This structure matters because it tells us that destruction was not imagined as pure finality. The lament is not only elegy, it is transition work. It names what was, it mourns what is gone, and in mourning, it preserves the form of what must be restored. That may be why these texts feel so ritualized. Their repetitions are not literary excess. They are mnemonic fidelity. They are making sure the city remains describable, even when it is no longer standing. The gods' names, the temple arrangements, the proper functions, the sacred character of the place, these are all retained in language, so that the city can remain present as pattern, even when absent as matter. That is exactly how a cyclical civilization would grieve, not by saying only it is gone, but by saying this is what it was, this is how it must return. The fall of Ur around 2000 BC, preserved in lamentation and confirmed in broad outline by history, becomes a model. The city is devastated. Political order collapses. The gods seem to have departed. Yet the lament never imagines that the sacred structure of reality has simply ended. Rather, it shifts into appeal. The destruction had to be passed through. The next question becomes when the gods will return, when rebuilding will resume, when the pattern will be active again. This is not naive optimism. It is patterned expectation. Nippur shows the same thing. Across thousands of years, the site endured repeated damage, rebuilding shifts of importance, restorations of temple structures, renewed sacred centrality. It did not survive because nothing happened to it. It survived because enough continuity remained at each rupture to make restoration meaningful. The site itself carried pattern memory. The texts carried it. The priesthood carried it. The temple economy carried it. Even ruins became placeholders for return. This way of thinking also explains something that otherwise looks odd. Why rebuild in the same places, on the same foundations, again and again, even after catastrophe? From a purely pragmatic viewpoint, another site might sometimes make more sense. But for the Mesopotamians, sacred geography mattered because pattern was attached to place. A temple was not merely a building. It was the current embodiment of an eternal relation between heaven and earth at a particular node. To abandon the node entirely would be to abandon access to the pattern concentrated there. So cities rose again where cities had fallen, not because people lacked imagination, because they were following forms. This repeated restoration at the urban level mirrors exactly what the king list claims at the civilizational level after the flood. The flood is simply the greatest lament and the greatest rebuilding. The same logic holds. Ordered life is broken. The patterns survive. The seat of kingship is restored. Civilization returns. The old Babylonian revival after the fall of Ur III, the later Neo-Babylonian restorations, the Assyrian claims to rebuild ancient temples according to ancient plans. All of these historical phenomena begin to look less like mere antiquarianism and more like a deeply rooted conviction that legitimacy lies in restoration of correct forms. To rule well is not to invent endlessly. It is to align present power with the ancient enduring patterns. This conviction is the opposite of modern progressive self-understanding. For us, legitimacy often comes from novelty reform rupture with old forms. For Mesopotamia, legitimacy more often comes from fidelity to forms that descend from beyond the present. The eternal matters more than the unprecedented. The successful city is not the one most original, but the one most correctly aligned. That alignment is what survives the fall. This also explains why temple institutions remain so powerful. They were not simply religious centers in the narrow sense. They were continuity machines. They maintained rites, archives, education, economic reserves, sacred geography, and inherited forms of order. Palaces rose and fell faster. Empires came and went. Temples endured because they served the deeper pattern. And from that perspective, the city laments become more than poems of sorrow. They are preservation devices. A city may be physically reduced to dust. But if its lament survives, if its form is remembered, then it has not been completely erased from the cycle. It can still return. This is perhaps the emotional core of Mesopotamian civilization, not simple fatalism, not passive acceptance of disaster, but disciplined awareness that destruction is part of the pattern and that human responsibility lies in preserving what allows restoration afterward. That is why archives matter. That is why ritual matters. That is why foundation deposits matter. That is why copying old texts matters. That is why rebuilding ancient temples exactly matters. All of it is one answer to catastrophe. Not prevent it absolutely, preserve through it. The same logic reaches back into the flood traditions. The flood hero survives because he knows. The city survives because its forms are remembered. Kingship survives because it descends again as the same institution. The Emi survive because they were never reducible to any one manifestation. The stars survive because the heavens keep cycling above human ruin. Everything converges on the same point. Reality is not permanent in manifestation. It is resilient in pattern. And if the pattern is preserved, then destruction is not the end of history, but the trough before another rise. From that angle, the Mesopotamian laments are almost startlingly modern in their deepest question, though not in their answer. They ask, in effect, what must be remembered so that after devastation, a world can be made again? Their answer is not innovation from nothing. It is restoration from preserved forms. And that preserved form, whether one calls it the me-sacred order civilizational template or a simply inherited structure, is what their entire culture seems designed to carry across time, across flood, across empire, across ruin, across forgetting. The annual New Year festival, the Akitu, may be the clearest ritual expression of everything the texts imply, not because it explains the cycle directly in modern language, but because it performs the cycle so openly. For 12 days, Babylon, and in related forms other Mesopotamian centers, entered a ritual sequence in which cosmic order was dissolved, reasserted, and renewed. This was not mere pageantry. In Mesopotamian understanding, ritual did not symbolize reality from a safe distance. Ritual operated on reality. To perform the right acts at the right time in the right order was to keep the world aligned. On the fourth day, the Enuma Elish was recited. Creation itself was spoken again, not as ancient memory only, but as active reordering. On another day, the king was stripped, humiliated, reduced, forced to confess before Marduk. His regalia were removed. His office was suspended. Then it was restored. The lesson is unmistakable. Authority descends, is removed, is reauthorized. Kingship is not self-generated. It must be renewed. Then the divine statues from across the land were gathered. The assembly of the gods was reenacted. Destinies for the coming year were fixed. Marduk departed the city and returned. The city passed symbolically through divine absence and back into presence. Sacred marriage ensured fertility. Creation was renewed. Order was made present again. That is a cycle, and not a hidden one. It is annual, public enacted. Why do this every year if creation happened only once, and if order remains secure by default? The most plausible answer is the Mesopotamian one, because order does not remain secure by default. It tends toward decline. It must be periodically renewed. Without reenactment, maintenance fails. Without maintenance, chaos advances. This is the flood logic in miniature. It is the city lament logic in miniature. It is the Inanna and Dumuzi logic in miniature. Dissolution, absence, humiliation, darkness, then reinstatement, return, reauthorization, fertility, restored order. The Akitu teaches the cycle not by explaining it abstractly, but by making everyone live through it in ritual time. The king feels it. The priests perform it. The city witnesses it. The cosmos is renewed by passing through the same pattern that governs gods, seasons, dynasties, and civilizations. That is why the festival can be read as more than religion narrowly understood. It is civilizational maintenance. It trains the community in what order is, how it is lost, how it is restored. It teaches that creation is not one finished act in the far past. It is an ongoing necessity. The world must be made again and again. And if that is the annual rhythm, then one can see how larger catastrophes might be understood, not as unimaginable breaks, but as greater turns in the same underlying pattern. The flood is the Akitu at vast scale. The old world dissolves. Chaos returns. The right forms, if preserved, allow order to descend again. This reading also changes the status of myth. Myth becomes operational. The Enuma Elish is not simply a story about Marduk defeating Tiamat. It is a template for moving from chaos to order. The humiliation and restoration of the king is not only political symbolism, it is a practical lesson in the dependency and renewability of authority. The procession of divine images is not only festival beauty, it is the enacted assembly by which destinies are determined. From inside this system, ritual is never just remembrance. It is rehearsal. It is renewal. It is preservation of procedure for use now and, if necessary, later after greater ruptures. One begins to understand why such a civilization would invest so heavily in exact repetition, why preserve old formulas, old languages, old routes of procession, old liturgical sequences. Because if repetition maintains order, then carelessness is dangerous. Deviation risks disconnection from the pattern. This is not superstition in the dismissive sense. It is a different philosophy of continuity. Form matters because form carries effective relation to reality. Precision matters because restoration depends on doing things in ways that reactivate the correct structure. Again, the same theme. Not invention, but faithful reinstantiation. The Akitu also clarifies why the Mesopotamians did not necessarily see catastrophe and renewal as opposites. Renewal requires passing through controlled dissolution. The king must be stripped before he can be reauthorized. The god must depart before he can return in triumph. Chaos must be named and ritually confronted before order can be established for the new year. Without this passage, there is no proper renewal. That idea scales upward easily. A civilization may likewise require passage through dissolution, not because suffering is good in itself, but because order is not self-sustaining forever. It decays. It becomes unstable. It must either be renewed ritually and structurally, or else break more violently. The flood traditions may preserve precisely such a violent break at the civilizational scale. So when we ask whether human life repeats itself in Mesopotamian, understanding the answer begins to look less speculative and more obvious. Their entire ritual year says yes, not in the crude sense that every detail repeats identically, but in the deeper sense that reality moves through recurring forms. The annual festival encodes the law of recurrence into public time. This would also explain why these people copied their texts with such determination. A ritual can preserve pattern communally. A tablet can preserve it across rupture. Together they create redundancy. If temples fall, texts may survive. If texts burn, ritual memory may remain. If kings die, the office returns. If cities burn, the sacred site remains. All of it points toward one priority: make restoration possible. And once again, the flood reappears from another angle. The flood is not an isolated curiosity inside the king list. It is the largest visible statement of a structure the culture was already living every year. Order falls, order returns. The crucial question is always the same. What survives the fall that allows the return? The Mesopotamian answer, repeated with quiet insistence, across myths, laments, king lists, rituals, and archives, is equally consistent. The pattern survives if it is preserved. And beneath all of this stands the Enuma Elish, not only as creation epic, but as the most concentrated statement of how the Mesopotamians thought order itself came into being, when on high heaven had not yet been named, when below the earth had not yet been called by name. Water mingled with water, undifferentiated, unbounded, primordial. Already the logic is cyclical rather than linear in the modern sense. Order is not the obvious original condition of reality. Chaos is. Or perhaps not chaos in the crude sense of mere disorder, but undifferentiated potential, unseparated waters, unstructured reality. Creation is the act of division, assignment, naming, positioning. Heaven and earth are separated. The gods receive stations. Celestial bodies receive courses. Humanity is made. Babylon is established. Order is built out of prior indeterminacy. That matters because what has been built can, in principle, be unbuilt. If creation is organization, then dissolution is possible. If the cosmos depends on maintained separation and assigned roles, then failure of that maintenance can mean return toward the primordial. The conflict between Marduk and Tiamat dramatizes this. Order does not emerge by gentle unfolding. It emerges through struggle, through the imposition of structure upon a more ancient, fluid power. Tiamat is not annihilated into nothing. Her body becomes cosmos. Chaos is reorganized, not erased. The possibility of return, then, is never completely absent. The primordial remains the material from which the ordered world is made. That is why the epic had to be recited again and again. Creation was not safely behind them. It had to be renewed. This is perhaps the deepest key to Mesopotamian cyclical thought. The world is not a stable machine wound once and left to run. It is a maintained order, perpetually threatened by disintegration, requiring ritual kingship, divine favor, correct structure, and human participation to remain itself. The line between cosmos and chaos is held not guaranteed. If that is true, then the flood traditions become even more intelligible. A flood is not merely weather. It is the return of undifferentiated water over ordered land. It is Tiamat rising in a sense against city boundary, canal field, temple, and throne. It is decreation. The flood sweeps over, because sweeping over is exactly what chaos does to differentiated order. And if flood is decreation, then post-flood restoration is recreation. That is why kingship descends again. That is why the city can be rebuilt. That is why the same formulas return. That is why the texts feel less like stories of singular disaster and more like documentation of a repeating law. Cosmos emerges from chaos, falls toward chaos, and must be made cosmos again. Humanity's role inside the Enuma Elish also becomes clearer in this light. Humans are created to relieve the gods of labor, yes. But that labor is not trivial. It is the work of maintaining the ordered world. Ritual service, agriculture offerings, administration, temple life, all of it belongs to the maintenance of the created cosmos. Human civilization is not an incidental side effect. It is part of the machinery of order. This means civilizational collapse is never merely political from a Mesopotamian perspective. When cities fall, rituals cease, temples are defiled, calendars are interrupted, kingship lapses and archives burn, cosmic maintenance is threatened. The fall of a city is a local event and a cosmic event at once. The city laments understand this perfectly. They do not describe only ruined walls. They describe disturbed order between heaven and earth. So once more, the pattern converges. The Enuma Elish shows order arising from watery undifferentiation. The flood traditions show ordered civilization swallowed again by water. The Akitu festival reenacts dissolution and recreation. The city laments preserve the forms needed after collapse. The king list marks kingship before and after the dividing waters. The myths of descent and return place gods themselves inside the same rhythm. The stars trace repetition overhead, and the me endure beneath every temporary manifestation. At some point, the cumulative pattern becomes too strong to ignore. Even if one chooses the most cautious reading, symbolic, theological, non-literal, the structure remains the same. Mesopotamian civilization thought in cycles. It preserved itself through cycles. It imagined catastrophe not as impossible aberration, but as one phase in a patterned reality. And it devoted enormous energy to ensuring that when the phase of restoration came, the knowledge required would still exist. This is where the question becomes harder to dismiss. What if the Sumerians were not naive inventors of strange myths about impossible kings and magical floods? What if they were disciplined preservers of a worldview built on observed recurrence, astronomical, seasonal, dynastic, agricultural, ritual, and perhaps civilizational? That does not force one to accept every number literally. It does force one to take the pattern seriously, because the pattern is not isolated, it is everywhere. And perhaps this is why the ancient texts have survived with such stubborn power, not because they offer easy answers, but because they preserve a conception of history very different from our own. A conception in which survival does not mean permanent escape from collapse. It means learning how to preserve forms through collapse so that the world can be made again. The Mesopotamians did not imagine security as final. They imagined continuity as resilient. That is a different kind of wisdom, a darker one perhaps, but perhaps also a more durable one. So the question remains where it began. What if they were right? Not necessarily right in every literal detail, not necessarily right in ways that can be reduced to a modern diagram, but right about the pattern. Right that civilization is not only progress, Write that knowledge can be preserved through rupture. Write that what appears lost may return if the forms are maintained. Write that the deepest work of a culture is not only to build, but to remember how to build again. The clay prism behind museum glass says very little, and that little is enough to disturb everything around it. Kings before the flood. Then the flood swept over. Kings after the flood. Same formula, same office, same descent of kingship from heaven. The flood does not erase the pattern. It divides one phase from another. Other tablets widen the picture. Atrahasis shows repeated catastrophes and repeated survival through knowledge. The Eridu Genesis preserves a flood inside a documentary atmosphere. The astronomical compendia reveal a culture obsessed with recurrence proportion, return long cycles that exceed a single human life. Inanna descends and returns. Dumuzi descends and returns. Cities are destroyed and rebuilt. The Akitu festival dissolves and recreates the cosmos each year. The Enuma Elish describes order as something imposed, maintained, and therefore vulnerable to reversal. Everywhere, the same intuition returns. Life is patterned. Civilization is patterned. Catastrophe is patterned. Restoration is patterned. That does not prove a simple doctrine that human life repeats identically forever. The texts are subtler than that. Repetition for the Mesopotamians is not mechanical duplication. It is structural recurrence. The same forms returning in new instantiations, the same rhythms moving through different ages, the same descent and return again and again, from annual ritual to civilizational memory. This is why the distinction between mythology and memory begins to feel less stable than modern categories prefer. The Sumerians may have encoded historical memory in mythic language and mythic truth in historical forms. The king list is record-like. The flood epics are narrative. The laments are ritual grief. The astronomical texts are technical, yet all of them speak into one another. Together, they form not one genre, but one worldview. A worldview in which what matters most is not whether this exact king lived exactly this many years in the way a modern historian would calculate it, but whether the pattern preserved in the record was real. And the pattern, at least in their understanding, was very real. That may be why they preserved it with such tenacity. 3,000 years of copying tablets, maintaining old languages, rebuilding sacred sites, reciting old epics, training scribes in archaic systems, archiving astronomical observations across generations, performing rituals that enacted dissolution and return. This is not casual tradition. It is civilizational seriousness. It is the labor of people who think what they are preserving may be needed far beyond themselves. If they were wrong, then what they left behind is still extraordinary, a body of myth, ritual mathematics, and political memory of almost unmatched coherence. If they were right, then what they left behind is more than literature. It is an archive for renewal. That is the uncomfortable edge of all this. The tablets do not demand belief. They are quieter than that. They sit in museums. They wait in catalogs. They survive in broken lines and reconstructed columns and copied texts. They say only what they say, but what they say, taken together, is not small. It is that human civilization may not be a singular ascent. It may be something older, stranger, more fragile, and more recurrent. Something that rises, something that falls, something that comes back by means of preserved form. And perhaps that is why the Mesopotamians looked both backward and upward with such intensity. Backward because the old patterns were already known. Upward because the heavens taught recurrence. Between archive and sky, between ruin and ritual, they maintained a worldview in which endings were rarely final, and beginnings were often returns. We do not know finally whether they were correct in the strongest sense. We do know they believed these patterns deeply enough to organize civilization around them. That alone matters, because beliefs of that depth shape what a civilization preserves, and what it preserves shapes what future ages are able to recover. The prism remains behind glass. The wedge marks remain legible. The flood remains in the middle of the list, not at the end. That detail may say as much as anything. The flood is not the conclusion of the record. It is an interruption inside the record. After it, the list goes on. Kingship descends again. The city changes. The pattern does not. And perhaps that is the most haunting possibility the Sumerians leave us with. Not that everything returns exactly, but that enough returns for continuity to survive catastrophe. Enough returns for civilization to stand up again. Enough returns that what feels unprecedented may in fact be another turn in something very old fact, be another turn in something very old. The texts do not close the question. They keep it open. They keep it open across 4,000 years. And in that open question, there is both warning and consolation. Warning, because what has risen can fall. Consolation, because what has fallen may rise again if the knowledge survives. So the final question does not disappear. It only becomes quieter, deeper, more difficult to ignore. If human life repeats itself not as exact duplication, but as civilizational cycle, then what are archives for? What are rituals for? What are old languages, copied tablets, preserved numbers, foundation deposits, sacred sites, and recited epics for? The Mesopotamian answer seems clear. They are for carrying pattern through rupture. They are for ensuring that when the waters come, whatever form the waters take, the world is not left with nothing. They are for restoration. They are for return. They are for the next descent of kingship. And so the mystery remains where the clay left it, patient, quiet, unresolved, and still very much alive. Not whether the Sumerians imagined cycles. They did. Not whether they preserved them. They did. But whether what they preserved was only symbolic wisdom, or whether it was also the oldest surviving documentation of a truth about civilization that we have forgotten and that they somehow remembered.